Hello, hello. Lovely to have you here. In today's video, I want to discuss what might be the end goal of Buddhism. What would happen to humanity in the view of, let's say, the Buddhist Dharma? This is a question I got a while back from a viewer of mine, David Norris. As always, love to have your questions. If I haven't done videos on them, and I will. So feel free always to leave questions and comments below the videos. I always enjoy them. I try to read every one and comment on the ones that I can. So in any event, what is this end goal of Buddhism? I'm going to give a couple of answers here. One is sort of what you might call a sort of a quick and dirty answer, just sort of a quick answer, but that's not quite accurate. And then I'm going to give a longer, I think, better answer after that. I'll be dealing, when I'm in these answers, I'm going to be dealing mostly with the view that you will get in early Buddhism. That's generally what I focus on here. But at the end, I'll discuss a little bit about some later Buddhist ideas as well. It's important to keep in mind that the views on these kinds of matters changed pretty significantly in Buddhism over the centuries, and that they are different, or they may be different in different schools. So I don't want to speak for all schools of Buddhism. And that's one thing I think we should always keep in mind when you have these large questions about what Buddhism might say about such and so. But in any event, let's turn to the sort of more quick and dirty kind of answer here, because I think this is the view, the response that David Norris was probably looking for, which is that we might say, okay, the end goal of Buddhism is for all of us to become enlightened, for all of us to become arahants. That's the, if we're coming to it from an early Buddhist perspective. And so all of these, all of us, all sentient beings, all humans and then all sentient beings would attain nirvana, would become enlightened, would attain parinirvana, that is to say they would pass away, and then eventually the worlds would be devoid of human life, and indeed would be devoid of sentient life, because all sentient life would have become enlightened. That's the sort of quick and dirty picture of what we might say about Buddhism. Now, it's also important to say that in such a picture, we cannot say that all sentient life has literally ceased to exist, that it no longer exists. Now, why would I say that? Well, because this is one of the Buddha's famous unanswered questions. What happens to an enlightened person after they die? This is a question where he rejected the claim that such a being did not exist after death. He rejected the claim that they did exist after death. He rejected the claim that they did and did not exist in different respects after death, or that they neither did nor did not exist after death. I mean, all four of these possibilities he rejected. What this leaves us with is, it's one of the unanswered questions. What happens after, in this sort of quick and dirty picture of the sort of end of the world, if you like, there's no answer as to what exactly happens to such beings. Now, this is perhaps sort of vaguely reminiscent of the Christian notion of the rapture, where all of the saved are sort of ascend to some undetermined or unknown sort of heaven, leaving the world perhaps completely uninhabited, depending on how you interpret these things. Or the world itself becomes heaven. Again, different pictures in Christianity. But this similarity should perhaps key us into the possibility that what we're describing here is misleading. It's really a quick and dirty picture of what Buddhism might say, in the sense that it's really not accurate. So why do I say it's inaccurate? Well, that's because the whole idea of an end goal for the world is not something that you find in Indian philosophy or religion in the way that you do in the West. In the West, there's an idea of time as essentially linear, leading in one particular direction. Leading, for example, in terms of Christianity, up to the rapture, up to the end of the world, up to Armageddon, if you like. Or nowadays we have the idea of leading up to the singularity. In other words, these pictures of linear time can take on a different metaphor in the case of technological results as opposed to religious ones. But that's again a very Western or Christian kind of picture of time. In India, time is understood as more cyclical, of sort of there being ups, but those ups are always going to be succeeded by downs. So the world may be on an upswing now, or it may be on a downswing now, depending on your point of view. But in either respect, it'll eventually change and either go down or come up. Things will reverse at some point in the future. And again, we'll cycle back around. That's kind of the picture. And so the very idea of there being an end goal is sort of alien here. There is no end to the world. The world simply cycles. Also, the idea of what we mean by enlightenment, as well as the structure of the Buddhist Sangha, makes the potential of all of us attaining enlightenment at the same time as virtually impossible. Enlightenment itself is a truly deep and profound change in our own self-conception and our conception of how we fit into the world. It's the complete ending of all attachments. In particular, the ending of attachments to family, attachments to making a living, to money, to wealth, to ownership. And this kind of ending of attachments really makes the most sense from within a monastic context. Or if you're talking about a layperson, it's going to be a layperson who lives a nearly monastic lifestyle. Indeed, this giving up of attachments to possessions and to making a living means that that kind of lifestyle is really only going to be possible, or most likely, shall we say, when it occurs within a context of lay support for the Sangha. So that is, in the traditional Buddhist Sangha, there's this idea that lay people donate such things as food, as medicine, as clothing, as housing to the monastic inhabitants so that they can give those things up. That's part of the relinquishment of attachment to ownership that's part and parcel of becoming enlightened. And then we have to look to the Vinaya, the rules for the monastics, which include such things as that monastics are not allowed to grow or make their own food. The Buddha laid down such rules simply because he wished to maintain this close contact between laity and monastics. He did not want the monastics to become too isolated. But what that means is that in order for there to be a healthy monastic community, there has to be a larger, healthy lay community around it that is wealthy enough to support the monastics. And such a picture clearly would mean that most of the people would not be enlightened, because they would be pursuing standard kinds of possession and ownership sorts of lifestyles. They would be making money. They would be making wealth in order to give it, or at least partly in order to give it to the Sangha. Further, even such a positive view is not going to last forever, given our understanding of cyclical time that I talked about before. Indeed, there are inklings in the early suttas that eventually all of this would disintegrate, that eventually the Sangha would fall apart, would disintegrate, would become less the sort of thing that you would want to donate to, shall we say. Eventually the Dharma itself would be corrupted and forgotten. This is part of what the Buddha understood as the normal, long-term kind of progression of all things. And indeed, in the same vein, there are inklings in the early suttas that the Dharma would have flourished among prior Buddhas, eons before the present Buddha, that it would have flourished, perhaps an uncounted number of times. It would have flourished, it would have had an extensive effect, and then eventually it would have died out and then been rediscovered at a later date. These ideas of prior Buddhas took on greater currency in the centuries after the Buddha's lifetime as followers of the Buddha became less interested in simply becoming enlightened and looked more to the possibility of becoming Buddhas themselves. This is what eventually becomes known as the Bodhisattva path, where eventually they came up a number of vows that one would take as a bodhisattva, and one of these vows was the vow to literally save all sentient beings. At least that's one interpretation of the vow. That, we're talking about what's the final goal. Well, if you look at one of these bodhisattva vows, that final goal could be understood as the saving, that is to say, the bringing of all all beings to a state of enlightenment. Now, this is often framed as a somewhat sort of quixotic goal of one that is not literally achievable because it will take a potentially infinite amount of time. Now, it's never said in the early suttas anyway that there are an infinite number of sentient beings, but I think this is kind of understood, or could be understood anyway, and so literally bringing all sentient beings to enlightenment would, again, be a task that would take an infinite amount of time. So what we have here really, on either view, I think, is a view of deep time that is inherently cyclical. There'll be ups and downs. In either case, the Dharma will be discovered, it will be propagated, people will follow, and then eventually it will be lost, only to be rediscovered again. Bodhisattvas will go out and try to help people, but this will be a process that will take an potentially infinite amount of time through an infinite amount of world systems. This, I think, is the most realistic sort of long view picture of what Buddhism has to offer, or has to describe as things progress, again, into this ultimate future. Now, I did a past video on this idea of these past Buddhas and future Buddhas and how these stories seem to have arisen. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much for taking a look at all of this. If you want to help support the channel, take a look at my Patreon page as well. It's linked down below and up here on the screen. And see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.